What's up, nerds? Welcome back to another video. Hope you're having a great day. This is episode 4 of the Space Program History Series, and today we're going to be talking about the first human spaceflight and the first 2 programs with humans in it. And those 2 programs will be the Mercury program and the Soviet program. But before we jump into the video, the intro. So I'm going to say short what we are going to be talking about today, and that will be the first human in space and the 2 separate space programs. Oh, and keep in mind that the Soviets and the Americans are having a nuclear war all while this is happening. Crazy, huh? So let's start in 1958 when NASA was born. The US knew that they were behind in the space race, so NASA creates Project Mercury to find astronaut candidates. These are the different candidates: mountain climbers, race car drivers, deep sea divers, and heck, they even took into consideration circus performers. But ultimately, they settled on military test pilots as the best candidates. Now, switching over to the Soviets, they had a similar method of selecting their own cosmonauts, but they didn't consider so many different people. They only considered military personnel. NASA selected 36 out of 508 test pilots. Those 36 test pilots were invited to come to Loveless Clinic in Albuquerque to go through physical and mental exams. In the end, only half of the 36 candidates completed the exams, but only 7 were chosen to become astronauts. In 1959, NASA unveils the Mercury 7 astronauts right here. Astronaut derives from the Greek word astron, which means star, and nauts, which means sailor, so star sailor. Immediately, these 7 astronauts became something like celebrities. They were even featured on the cover of the Life magazine. But it would still be a couple of years before the first astronaut goes into space. Meanwhile, the Soviets were choosing their own cosmonauts. They chose 6 out of 20 young, fit military pilots. Those chosen cosmonauts were known as the Vanguard 6. Now let's speed run through the names of the Mercury 7 and Vanguard 6. Over here is the Mercury 7. On the bottom row, left to right, is Wally Schirra, Deke Slayton, John Glenn, and Scott Carpenter. On the top row, left to right, is Alan Shepard, Gus Grissom, and Leroy Gordon Cooper. So sadly, there was no image for the Vanguard 6, but I will still go through the names of them. Yuri Gagarin, German Titov, Grigoroy Nelibyov, Adrian Nikolaev, Pavel Popovich, Valery Bykovsky. Sorry if I butchered some of the names, but anyways, let's move on. NASA and the Soviets were now testing the rockets before they sent humans into space. We covered some of this topic in the last episode. Some of the US's rockets were blowing up, but nonetheless, every Mercury 7 astronaut was very eager to be the first one into space. But spoiler alert, none of the American astronauts were the first one in space. On April 12, 1961, Yuri Gagarin, who we mentioned before, launched in Vostok 1 and became the first human into space. He orbited one time in less than 2 hours and then returned home. Fast forward 1 month later, in 1961, Alan Shepard was the first American in space. He launched on the Mercury Redstone 1 on the Freedom 7 capsule. But Shepard's flight did not go into orbit, as this kind of flight is called suborbital, and his flight lasted around 20 minutes. After these 2 flights, NASA and the Soviets launched the rest of their astronauts. So yes, let's speedrun again through each launch. So after the first 2 launches, there were 2 more launches in 1961. NASA's Gus Grissom aboard the Mercury Redstone on July 21st for a suborbital flight in 1961. And the Soviets launched one more time in 1961 on August 6th. German Titov launched as the second Soviet in space. Now on to 1962. On February 20th, John Glenn launched aboard the Mercury Atlas to be the first American to orbit Earth. He completed 3 full orbits. On August 11th, 1962, Adrian Nikolaev of the Soviets launched and spent 4 entire days in orbit, and his partner Pavel Popovich launched a day after him. That marked the first time two manned spacecraft were in orbit together. The Americans also launched Scott Carpenter on May 24th, 1962. And if you guys want, I can make a separate video on Scott Carpenter's flight, because let's just say there were a bunch of mishaps. So tell me in the comments if you would want that. And the last flight of 1962 was Wally Schirra that the Americans sent into orbit. Now finally, we got to 1963, our last year. Gordon Cooper of the Americans launched on May 15th, and he was in orbit for 30 hours. Now on to our last two cosmonauts, Valery Bykovsky and Valentina Tereshkova, went on a dual mission, and Valentina Tereshkova was the first woman in space. And notice how I didn't mention one of the Americans and one of the Soviets, because they were both grounded for both their respective reasons. That's going to be it for the video, guys. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider subscribing, because it is very hard to make these videos, especially when you're an amateur. So please consider liking and subscribing. And if you haven't seen my other episodes, please watch those. And I'll catch you in the next episode.